The moment your silence appears, something shifts inside a narcissist, and it happens far faster than most people realize. Up until that point, the dynamic has felt familiar to them. They speak, you respond. They provoke, you explain. They withdraw, you chase. This rhythm gives them a sense of control because narcissistic patterns thrive on predictability and emotional feedback. Your reactions, whether loving, defensive, or hurt, reassure them that they still matter, that they still occupy space in your mind. Silence disrupts that entire system. Psychologically, narcissists rely heavily on external validation to regulate their sense of self. This isn't confidence, it's dependency. Their identity is propped up by attention, reaction, and emotional engagement from others. When you suddenly go quiet, the supply line they unconsciously depend on is cut off. And when that happens, the nervous system reacts with alarm. The calm exterior may remain for a moment, but internally panic begins to stir. What's important to understand is that your silence isn't interpreted as peace or maturity by a narcissist. It's interpreted as loss of control. They don't read it as you choosing yourself. They read it as something slipping out of their grasp. In their mind, silence raises a terrifying question. If I'm not being reacted to, do I still matter? That question strikes at the core of narcissistic insecurity. Philosophically, this reveals something profound about power in human relationships. Power doesn't belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to the person who no longer needs to speak. When you stop explaining, defending, or seeking validation, you reclaim your autonomy. And autonomy is deeply unsettling to someone who is accustomed to defining themselves through dominance or emotional leverage. This is why silence often triggers a sudden change in their behavior. You may notice them reaching out unexpectedly, sending messages that seem caring or confused, or even escalating into irritation or guilt-inducing comments. These are not signs of self-awareness. They are attempts to re-establish connection, not because they miss you, but because they miss the reassurance your attention provided. Your silence removes the mirror they use to see themselves. Without your emotional responses, they are left alone with their own uncertainty, and that's an uncomfortable place for someone who avoids introspection. The panic doesn't come from losing a relationship. It comes from losing regulation. They no longer know where they stand. And for someone who needs constant confirmation, that ambiguity feels threatening. This is where many people make a critical mistake. When the narcissist reaches out after silence, it's tempting to respond, to explain, to offer closure. But doing so often restores the old dynamic. The silence was powerful precisely because it shifted the balance. It wasn't punishment, it was clarity. It wasn't manipulation, it was self-respect. Your silence communicates something words never could. I no longer participate in dynamics that drain me. And that message lands deeply, even if it's never consciously acknowledged. So if you're wondering whether silence matters, understand this. It does. Not because it changes them, but because it changes you. It marks the moment you stop trying to be understood by someone incapable of truly seeing you. And when a narcissist panics at your silence, it's not proof of your power over them. It's proof of the power you've reclaimed for yourself. When your silence continues, something deeper begins to happen inside a narcissist. And this is where panic quietly sets in. Not the dramatic kind you might expect, but a controlled, internal alarm that tells them something is slipping beyond their influence. Narcissists are not distressed by loss in the way emotionally healthy people are. They are distressed by loss of control. Your silence represents exactly that. Psychologically, a narcissist relies on constant external feedback to regulate their sense of self. Attention, reactions, emotional responses. These are not luxuries for them, they are necessities. When you go quiet, you interrupt their supply. The familiar loop of action and reaction breaks, and suddenly they are left alone with uncertainty, and uncertainty is something they cannot tolerate. At first, they may tell themselves you're just busy. Then they may assume you'll come back once you cool down. But as time passes and your silence remains consistent, a more unsettling realization emerges. You may no longer be emotionally available to them. That thought threatens their internal narrative that they are central, important, and in control. Silence forces them to confront the possibility that they are no longer the main character in your emotional world. This is where panic begins, not as chaos, but as urgency. You might notice subtle changes, a sudden check-in message that feels casual but arrives out of nowhere, a memory drop designed to provoke nostalgia, or a tone shift that sounds warmer than usual. These are not coincidences. They are attempts to re-establish emotional access without appearing vulnerable. A narcissist will often reach out indirectly before they ever risk direct accountability. Philosophically, silence represents autonomy. It is the moment you stop explaining yourself, defending your boundaries, or seeking validation. For someone who thrives on emotional leverage, your autonomy feels like abandonment. Even if you owe them nothing, they are not panicking because they miss you deeply. They are panicking because they can no longer predict or manage you. What's important to understand is that this panic doesn't mean they've suddenly become self-aware or remorseful. It means the structure they depended on has cracked. You were part of their emotional ecosystem, and your silence removes a stabilizing force they took for granted. When you stop reacting, you stop feeding the dynamic that allowed them to feel powerful. This is also why your silence must remain clean. The moment you break it to explain, justify, or reassure, the panic subsides and control returns to them. Silence only works when it is rooted in clarity, not manipulation. You are not trying to provoke them, you are reclaiming yourself. And here's the deeper truth: your silence doesn't create their panic, it reveals it. It exposes how dependent they were on your emotional availability, even while pretending they didn't need you. That realization alone shifts the balance of power. So if you're tempted to speak just to ease the tension, pause. Let the discomfort exist, not for them, but for you. Because the moment you stop managing someone else's emotions is the moment you begin honoring your own. Silence is not absence. It is a declaration, and only those who depended on your presence fear it most. When your silence begins to register, the narcissist doesn't simply notice it, they interpret it. And what they interpret is threat. Silence, to a narcissistic personality, is never neutral. It is not calm, it is not distance, and it is certainly not peace. It is uncertainty, and uncertainty is the one state they cannot tolerate. Psychologically, narcissists rely on a continuous stream of feedback to regulate their sense of self. Attention reassures them that they exist, that they matter, that they are in control of the narrative. When you go quiet, that feedback loop breaks. There is no reflection coming back to them, no emotional data, no reassurance, and without that mirror, their internal stability begins to wobble. What's important to understand here is that your silence forces the narcissist to confront something they spend their life avoiding, not knowing what someone feels about them. Healthy people can tolerate ambiguity. Narcissists cannot. The moment you stop explaining, reacting, defending, or responding, their mind starts racing. Are they losing control? Have you seen through them? Are they no longer the center? This is where the panic quietly begins. You may notice sudden behavioral shifts. They might become unusually attentive, suddenly warm, overly charming, or dramatically apologetic. Not because they've reflected, but or your silence has destabilized their sense of dominance. Silence removes their ability to steer the emotional environment. And without that steering wheel, they feel exposed, Philosophically, silence is powerful because it restores authorship to you. Narcissistic dynamics depend on reaction. They provoke to feel powerful. They withhold to feel superior. They confuse to feel important. Your silence breaks that structure. It says, without words, you no longer get to dictate my emotional reality. That message lands harder than confrontation ever could. And this is why silence is often followed by escalation. If charm doesn't work, they may test boundaries. If warmth fails, they may provoke. If provocation fails, they may attempt guilt or victimhood. These are not random responses. They are attempts to re-establish emotional leverage. Any reaction will do because reaction equals relevance. But silence denies them relevance. This doesn't mean silence is a manipulation. In fact, true silence isn't performed for them at all. It's chosen for you. It's the natural result of clarity. You stop engaging not to punish, but because you no longer need to participate in emotional chaos to feel seen. And that self-containment is deeply unsettling to someone who feeds on external validation. There's also something quietly confronting about silence. It implies choice. You're not overwhelmed. You're not confused. You're not begging. You are choosing not to engage. And that choice signals strength, the kind of strength narcissists instinctively fear because it cannot be controlled. This is why silence often triggers attempts at re-entry, messages, sudden concern, a sense of urgency that didn't exist before. They are trying to confirm whether they still matter to you, whether they still have access, whether the dynamic still works. And here's the key insight. The moment a narcissist reacts to your silence, they've already revealed its power, because someone who truly holds power doesn't panic when attention disappears. So if your silence unsettles them, don't rush to fill the space. Let it teach you something. Let it show you who needed your noise more than they valued your peace. Silence doesn't announce strength. It exposes it. When your silence is finally noticed, what happens next is where the narcissist's internal world is most exposed. This is the moment. Panic quietly sets in, not always in obvious ways, but in subtle psychological shifts that reveal how deeply control, not connection, has been driving the dynamic. To understand this, you have to understand what silence represents to a narcissist. Silence is not neutral. Silence is a threat. For someone who relies on external validation to regulate their sense of self, your attention has been functioning like emotional oxygen. Even when the relationship felt difficult, confusing, or draining for you, your reactions, your explanations, your hurt, your availability were proof that they still mattered, that they still had influence. When that suddenly stops, their internal balance collapses. Your silence interrupts the feedback loop they depend on. Psychologically, this triggers a loss of control. Narcissists are not distressed because they miss you in the way a secure person misses someone. They are distressed because the narrative they were managing is no longer responding. They don't know what you're thinking. They can't predict your behavior, and unpredictability is deeply uncomfortable for someone whose self-worth depends on managing how they are perceived. This is why, after a period of silence, their behavior often changes. You may notice sudden attempts to reinsert themselves into your world, unexpected messages, casual check-ins, exaggerated concern, or even subtle provocations. Sometimes it's kindness, sometimes it's irritation, sometimes it's nostalgia. What all of these have in common is not love, but urgency. They are trying to re-establish relevance. Silence has made them feel invisible, and invisibility is intolerable. From a philosophical standpoint, this moment exposes the difference between attachment and possession. Healthy attachment respects autonomy. Possession panics when autonomy is exercised. Your silence is an act of self-direction, and that's CL. Direction destabilizes a person who was accustomed to defining the relationship on their terms. You didn't confront them. You didn't argue. You didn't explain. You simply withdrew your emotional participation. And that is far more disruptive than any emotional outburst could ever be. What's important to understand is that this panic is not a sign of emotional awakening. It's not proof that they suddenly understand your value. It's evidence that the structure they relied on has been removed. They are reacting to loss of access, not loss of intimacy. This distinction matters because misinterpreting their panic as genuine remorse can pull you back into a cycle you worked hard to step out of. Your silence creates a mirror they can't avoid. Without your responses, they are left alone with themselves, and that is precisely what they fear. So they reach outward, not inward. They look for ways to re-engage you rather than reflect on their behavior. That's why the panic feels restless rather than reflective. The deeper lesson here is about your power, not power over them, but power over your own emotional economy. When you stop feeding a dynamic that drains you, the imbalance becomes visible. You see clearly who is benefiting from the noise and who is unsettled by the quiet. Silence doesn't punish, it reveals. And when your absence creates panic, it's a sign that your presence was never taken for granted. It was being used. The moment you understand that, you stop confusing urgency with love and start choosing peace over chaos. When your silence truly lands, what often follows is escalation. This is the stage most people misunderstand because it doesn't always look like panic on the surface. Sometimes it looks like charm. Sometimes it looks like anger. Sometimes it looks like sudden vulnerability. But underneath all of it is the same thing, loss of control. And for a narcissist, loss of control is intolerable. Psychologically, narcissistic behavior is organized around regulation through others. Attention, reaction, reassurance, conflict, these are not side effects. They are fuel. When you go silent, that fuel supply is cut off. The narcissist is no longer able to stabilize their sense of self through your responses. And so the nervous system does what it always does when a regulator disappears. It scrambles to regain equilibrium. This is where you may see the shift. The person who once seemed distant suddenly reaches out. The one who ignored you now wants a conversation. Apologies appear that never existed before, or the tone flips, accusations, guilt, provocation, even cruelty. These are not random mood swings, they are attempts to re-engage the system. Any reaction will do as long as it restores connection and influence. From the outside, this can be confusing. You might think, if they didn't care, why are they suddenly doing all of this? But that question assumes the behavior is driven by emotional investment in the way healthy attachment works. It isn't. What you're witnessing is regulation-seeking behavior. Your silence has removed their ability to steady themselves through you, and the discomfort of that absence forces action. Philosophically, this moment reveals a hard truth about power in relationships. Power doesn't belong to the loudest person or the most dominant one. It belongs to the person who can remain grounded without needing to provoke a response. Silence, when it is intentional and self-contained, exposes dependency, and dependency does not tolerate uncertainty. This is also the most dangerous phase emotionally because escalation can masquerade as change. The sudden effort can feel validating. The intensity can feel like proof. But intensity born from panic is not the same as care born from respect. One is about restoring control. The other is about honoring autonomy. Confusing the two is how people get pulled back into cycles they worked hard to escape. Your role in this moment is not to interpret, explain, or rescue. It is to observe. Does their behavior respect your silence, or does it try to override it? Do they approach with curiosity and accountability or urgency and entitlement? The difference tells you everything you need to know. Silence doesn't provoke panic because it is cruel. It provokes panic because it is clarifying. It removes distraction. It removes leverage. It reveals who needs access to you to feel stable and who does not. And when you understand that, you stop mistaking escalation for love and start recognizing it for what it is, proof that your absence has power and that your presence should never be given to someone who only values it when it's gone. When you choose silence, something profound happens beneath the surface, especially with a narcissist. S is the moment many people misunderstand, because silence looks passive on the outside, but psychologically, it is anything but. For a narcissist, silence is not neutral. It is destabilizing. It removes the very thing they rely on to regulate themselves, your attention, your reaction, your emotional engagement. At their core, narcissists are not sustained by connection. They are sustained by control and validation. They need constant feedback to reassure themselves of their importance, their influence, their relevance. When you are speaking, explaining, reacting, or even arguing, you are still feeding that system. You are confirming that they matter enough to affect you. Silence, however, disrupts that loop entirely. It creates a vacuum, and narcissists do not tolerate vacuums well. Psychologically, this is where panic sets in. Without your response, they are forced to confront uncertainty. They don't know what you're thinking. They don't know where they stand. And most importantly, they don't know whether they still have access to you. That uncertainty strikes at the heart of their deepest fear, losing control and becoming irrelevant. Silence removes their ability to steer the narrative, to provoke reassurance, or to extract emotional supply. This is why silence often triggers sudden behavioral shifts. You may notice them reaching out unexpectedly, testing boundaries, becoming overly charming, or even attempting to provoke a reaction through criticism or guilt. These are not random acts. They are attempts to restore equilibrium, to get you talking again, reacting again, engaging again. Any response feels better to them than no response at all. Philosophically, silence represents autonomy. It is the moment you stop performing emotional labor for someone who thrives on it. And autonomy is deeply threatening to narcissistic dynamics. When you are silent, you are no longer participating in their version of reality. You are standing outside of it. That separation forces them to confront something they avoid at all costs, that they do not fully control how others feel or behave. What's important to understand is that your silence is not about punishment. It's about clarity. It signals a shift from reactivity to self-respect. You are no longer explaining yourself to be understood by someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. You are no longer justifying your boundaries to someone who sees boundaries as obstacles. Silence becomes a statement, not of withdrawal, but of strength. And this is where the power truly lies. When you remain calm, grounded, and silent, you stop negotiating your worth. You allow the dynamic to reveal itself. A healthy person responds to silence with curiosity, reflection, and respect. A narcissist responds with anxiety, manipulation, or panic. That contrast gives you information you cannot afford to ignore. This is also why silence must be intentional. It is not avoidance. It is presence without performance. You are still living, still grounded, still whole, but no longer available for emotional extraction. That shift alone changes everything. Because when someone panics in the absence of your voice, it tells you something crucial. They were never listening to understand you. They were listening to control you. And once you see that clearly, silence is no longer something you fear using. It becomes the moment you reclaim yourself and choose peace over permission.